His perfect lawn was reduced to a muddy mess overnight. His neighbor's massive dog turned Jackson's yard into a disaster, and when he confronted her, she just laughed. "It's just grass. Calm down." Arrogant and confident in her impunity, she had no idea that her disregard for his property would lead to her downfall. Jackson didn't let it slide. With cameras, evidence, and the support of his neighbors, he prepared a response that left everyone stunned. But let's start from the beginning. Jackson Bennett's lawn wasn't just a patch of grass. It was his pride, his escape, and his canvas. Each morning, he'd step outside with his coffee and admire the perfection he'd crafted. The emerald expanse of his lawn stretched flawlessly, every blade standing tall like soldiers in perfect formation. A vibrant mix of marigolds, petunias, and lavender lined the edges, blending into a masterpiece that seemed to burst with life. Neighbors often slowed their cars to admire his work, and some even stopped to ask for tips. Jackson's yard wasn't just the envy of the block, it was its crown jewel. But one sunny afternoon, that pristine beauty came crashing down. The first thing Jackson noticed as he stepped outside was a trail of chaos. Clumps of grass uprooted, muddy paw prints smeared across the yard, and crushed flower beds. His heart sank as his eyes scanned the destruction. Standing in the middle of it all, wagging his tail with pure innocence, was Bruno, the hulking Great Dane from next door. The dog was as big as a small horse, with paws to match, and those paws had torn through Jackson's hard work like it was a playground. Jackson froze for a moment, his breath caught between shock and fury. How could this happen? His lawn, his sanctuary, his art, reduced to a mess of mud and shredded greenery. The clenching anger propelled him to action. Without a second thought, Jackson stormed toward his neighbor's porch, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. Carol Reed sat there, as calm as could be, lounging with a tall glass of iced tea. She was the type of neighbor who seemed to think rules were optional, a self-proclaimed free spirit who treated the world like her personal sandbox. "Carol!" Jackson's voice carried his frustration as he gestured toward the wreckage behind him. "Your dog just destroyed my lawn." Carol tilted her head, sipping her tea slowly, as if savoring the moment. She glanced at Bruno, who had now flopped onto the grass like nothing had happened, his massive body sprawled in the mud. "Oh, Jackson," she said, her voice laced with nonchalance. "It's just grass. Don't be so dramatic." Jackson couldn't believe his ears. Just grass? Was she serious? Did she not see the hours of work, the care, the soul he'd poured into that lawn? Every fiber of his being screamed at her dismissiveness. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "It's not just grass, Carol. That lawn represents months of work, years of perfecting. Your dog ruined it, and you're brushing it off like it's nothing?" Carol shrugged, not even bothering to look concerned. "Bruno's just a dog, Jackson. Dogs do what dogs do. You can't expect me to chain him up just because he likes your yard. Maybe you should build a better fence or something." She punctuated her words with a casual sip of her drink, her indifference slicing through Jackson like a blade. That response lit a fire in him. It wasn't just her dog that had crossed the line, it was her attitude. The audacity of shrugging off the damage, the condescension in her tone, and the complete lack of accountability ignited a determination in Jackson. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jackson didn't sleep much that night. He couldn't get Carol's dismissive attitude out of his mind, her casual shrug echoing like a challenge. But Jackson wasn't one to let anger cloud his judgment. He spent the evening carefully documenting the damage, photographing every muddy paw print, every torn patch of grass, every crushed flower. He even collected an estimate from a local landscaper to restore the yard. The next morning, armed with his evidence, he knocked on Carol's door, determined to handle this maturely. Carol answered in her usual way, iced tea in hand, an air of carefree indifference. Jackson showed her the photos and handed her the repair quote, his voice steady but firm. "This is what it'll cost to fix the damage. I'm giving you a chance to make things right, Carol." Her reaction wasn't just unexpected, it was infuriating. She laughed, a sharp, dismissive laugh that hit Jackson like a slap. "You want me to pay $3,000 for some grass? Get real, Jackson. It's not my fault your yard is so delicate. Maybe pick a hobby that doesn't crumble under a dog's paws." Jackson felt his face flush. He opened his mouth to argue, but Carol cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Listen, Bruno's just being a dog. You can't expect me to control him every second. If your precious lawn means that much, maybe put up a real fence." With that, she turned and walked back into her house, leaving Jackson standing on the porch, stunned. He stared at the closed door, anger and frustration simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't just her words. It was the sheer arrogance, the refusal to acknowledge the harm caused. Over the next week, things only got worse. Bruno seemed to make Jackson's yard his personal stomping ground. Every time Jackson repaired a patch of grass, it was ruined again by fresh paw prints. The low fence Jackson hastily installed to keep Bruno out proved useless. Bruno vaulted over it with ease, his massive frame landing heavily on the other side, crushing whatever flowers happened to be in his path. Carol, far from showing any remorse, seemed to enjoy poking the bear. On more than one occasion, Jackson heard her loud remarks as he worked in his yard. If he cared so much, he'd invest in a proper fence, she'd say to no one in particular, though her voice was loud enough for Jackson to hear every word. It was the last straw. Jackson had tried reasoning, he had tried compromising. But Carol's attitude and Bruno's destructive streak had left him no choice. This wasn't just about grass anymore, it was about respect, accountability, and standing up for what was right. Feeling backed into a corner, Jackson decided it was time to take the gloves off. As he walked back into his house that evening, Jackson glanced at the stack of evidence he'd gathered. Photos, repair quotes, and notes from his previous attempts to resolve the issue. It was clear that the only way forward was to take a stand. This time, Carol would have to listen. Not because she wanted to, but because she'd have no other choice. Jackson knew he couldn't rely on Carol's goodwill, mainly because she didn't seem to have any. Her dismissive attitude and Bruno's nightly wrecking sprees left him no choice but to fight back with cold, hard facts. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jackson unpacked a set of motion-activated cameras he had picked up earlier that day. Each device was carefully positioned around his yard, one overlooking the flower beds, another trained on the patch of grass Bruno seemed to favor, and a third capturing the entire perimeter. The cameras were sleek and small, blending seamlessly with the garden's landscape. Jackson set them to record every movement, no matter how slight. It wasn't just about catching Bruno in the act, it was about building an airtight case. As he secured the last camera, a sense of quiet determination settled over him. This wasn't just for his lawn anymore, it was for the principal. The results came faster than Jackson expected. The very next morning, he reviewed the footage and couldn't believe his eyes. There was Bruno, under the cover of darkness, tearing through the flower beds like a battering ram. The oversized dog bounded across the lawn, leaving deep gouges in the soil, and then sprawled out on the grass, as if he owned it. The next clip showed him sauntering back to Carol's yard, his muddy paws leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Over the next few days, Jackson's cameras captured it all. Bruno crushing Jackson's newly planted flowers, knocking over garden decorations, and even attempting to dig a hole near the mailbox. Each time, the dog looked as carefree as ever, completely oblivious to the mess he left behind. But the cameras weren't just for catching Bruno. Jackson also began documenting every interaction with Carol. Anytime she made a sarcastic comment or brushed off his concerns, he jotted it down in a small notebook. It wasn't long before the pieces started coming together, a clear timeline of negligence and defiance. Determined to strengthen his case, Jackson reached out to his neighbors. He figured if Bruno was this destructive on his property, surely others had stories to share, and boy did they. One neighbor recounted how Bruno had trampled her vegetable garden, leaving her prized tomatoes flattened. Another described the time Bruno knocked over her trash bins, scattering garbage across the driveway. But the most alarming story came from a family down the street whose young daughter had been frightened by Bruno's sudden appearance in their backyard. The child had been playing outside when Bruno charged through the gate barking loudly. While the dog didn't harm her, the incident left her shaken. Jackson realized he wasn't alone in his frustration. Carol's disregard for the community extended far beyond his lawn, and it was clear her behavior had gone unchecked for too long. Armed with first-hand accounts from neighbors and hours of video evidence, Jackson decided it was time to make his move. He drafted a formal demand letter, meticulously detailing the damage, the evidence, and the stories he'd gathered. The letter wasn't just a plea for compensation, it was a clear warning that he wasn't backing down. Jackson delivered the letter to Carol's door with a calm but resolute expression. Carol's reaction was as predictable as it was infuriating. She skimmed the letter, her lips curling into a smirk. "Oh, Jackson," she said, shaking her head. "You're really doing all this over some grass? Go ahead, take me to court. You're wasting your time." Her words were dismissive, but Jackson caught a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Just a hint that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as confident as she seemed. As Carol turned and closed the door, Jackson stood there for a moment, letting her words settle. "Challenge accepted," he muttered under his breath, a steely resolve in his voice. Carol might have underestimated him, but she was about to learn just how determined Jackson could be. This wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. It was a fight for accountability. And Jackson was ready. The courtroom buzzed with quiet chatter as the case of Bennett v. Reed was called. Jackson sat at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer beside him, a neat stack of evidence, carefully prepared and ready. His heart pounded, not from doubt, but from anticipation. He had spent weeks gathering irrefutable proof, and now he was ready to present it. Across the room, Carol strolled in as if she were attending a garden party. Her confident smirk and relaxed posture made it clear she thought this was all a waste of her time. As the judge entered, the room fell silent. Carol's lawyer opened by painting a picture of Bruno as a harmless family pet, and Jackson as an overzealous neighbor who couldn't handle a little inconvenience. Carol nodded along, her demeanor dripping with indifference. But when Jackson's lawyer began, the tone of the room shifted. The first exhibit was the video footage. The courtroom watched as Bruno, a massive silhouette under the moonlight, bounded into Jackson's yard, tearing through flower beds and leaving deep gouges in the grass. The footage was clear, undeniable. Next came the photos, close-ups of the damage, juxtaposed with images of Jackson's yard before Bruno's escapades. The vibrant green lawn, once pristine, now looked like a battlefield. The contrast was staggering. Then came the testimonies. Neighbor after neighbor took the stand, recounting their own encounters with Bruno. One described a toppled vegetable garden, another a driveway littered with garbage. The young mother from down the street spoke of the moment Bruno startled her child, her voice trembling as she relived the fear. Carol's defense? She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, and repeated the same line she'd used from the beginning. "Bruno's just being a dog. It's not a big deal." Her lawyer tried to argue that Jackson was overreacting, suggesting that a few paw prints didn't warrant such a fuss. But the evidence was overwhelming. The judge's expression grew increasingly serious as each piece of the puzzle fell into place. By the time the landscaper testified, estimating the total cost of repairs at $5,000, it was clear which way the case was heading. In his closing statement, Jackson's lawyer didn't just highlight the damage to the property, he emphasized the principle of responsibility. "Owning a pet comes with obligations," he said, his voice firm. "Mr. Bennett has gone above and beyond to resolve this issue civilly, only to be met with indifference and dismissiveness. This isn't just about a lawn, it's about accountability." The judge leaned forward, addressing Carol directly. "Miss Reed, the evidence presented today paints a clear picture. Your dog repeatedly caused significant damage to Mr. Bennett's property, and you failed to take appropriate measures to prevent it. Pet ownership is not an excuse for negligence." The verdict was swift and decisive. Carol was ordered to pay $5,000 in damages to Jackson and to construct a secure fence on her property to ensure Bruno couldn't roam freely. The judge warned that failure to comply would result in further penalties. As the gavel came down, a collective sigh swept through the room. Jackson sat back, a wave of relief washing over him. Carol, on the other hand, looked stunned. Her confident facade had cracked, and for the first time, she seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. Outside the courtroom, Jackson shook hands with his lawyer, gratitude evident in his expression. He had fought for what was right, and justice had prevailed. Watching Carol storm off without a word, Jackson felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge. It was about standing up for himself and setting a boundary that should never have been crossed. The morning sun cast a warm glow over Jackson's lawn, its vibrant green surface gleaming like a polished emerald. The repairs were complete, every blade of grass standing tall and proud once again. Flowers that had been trampled beyond recognition now flourished, their bright colors a testament to resilience. Jackson took a deep breath, the fresh scent of soil and blooming lavender filling the air. This wasn't just a yard, it was a symbol of everything he'd fought for. Word of the courtroom victory spread quickly through the neighborhood, and with it, Carol's once overbearing arrogance began to crumble. Her reputation, once defined by her dismissive smirks and sharp remarks, now carried a very different weight. Neighbors whispered about her in hushed tones, sharing knowing glances as they passed her house. She had become the subject of not-so-friendly neighborhood gossip, her name synonymous with irresponsibility and poor judgment. Bruno, once the terror of Jackson's yard, was now confined to his own. A sturdy fence enclosed Carol's property, a clear line that neither pause nor attitude could cross. It was oddly quiet without Bruno's nightly escapades, and the absence of destruction brought a calm that Jackson hadn't felt in months. Neighbors began stopping by Jackson's house, not just to admire his beautifully restored yard, but to express their gratitude. "You really stood up for all of us," Mrs. Carter said, her voice warm with appreciation. "Carol's dog ruined my garden last year, but I never had the courage to confront her." Others echoed her sentiment, sharing their own stories of frustration with Carol's blatant disregard for boundaries. For Jackson, the victory wasn't just personal, it was communal. By taking a stand, he had set a precedent, sending a clear message that disrespect for others' property wouldn't be tolerated. The neighborhood felt more united, more empowered, knowing that someone had stood up for what was right. As Jackson stood on his lawn, soaking in the satisfaction of a hard-won battle, he couldn't help but smile. The grass beneath his feet felt softer, the air lighter. He knew this wasn't just about restoring a patch of land. It was about restoring balance, about proving that accountability matters. "Not bad, huh?" Jackson murmured to himself, running a hand through his hair as he surveyed his handiwork. It wasn't arrogance in his tone, just a quiet pride, the kind that comes from knowing you've done the right thing. From her porch, Carol glared in silence, her iced tea untouched beside her. Jackson caught her gaze for a brief moment and gave her a polite nod before turning back to his yard. There was no need for gloating. The victory spoke for itself. For the first time in months, Jackson felt at peace. As he leaned down to adjust a sprig of lavender, he smiled again. This wasn't just about grass. It was about standing tall, just like his lawn now did. And in that moment, with the sun warm on his back and the neighborhood quiet around him, Jackson knew he'd done more than win a case. He'd earned the respect of those around him, and that was worth far more than money or grass.